The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. The judge leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at the defendant, a young black man in his late 20s, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and slacks. The man stood tall, his posture calm but firm, his eyes steady. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a courtroom, at least not in the way most people expected. He didn't have the polished demeanor of a lawyer or the nervous energy of someone desperate to prove their innocence. He just looked ordinary. And that, it seemed, was enough to amuse the judge. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his voice dripping with a mix of condescension and amusement. "You're representing yourself today? Is that correct?" The question hung in the air, and the faintest chuckle escaped the judge's lips, as if the idea of this young man navigating the complexities of the legal system on his own was nothing short of laughable. The courtroom, sensing the judge's tone, rippled with quiet murmurs. Even the prosecutor, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for crushing defendants, allowed himself a small, smug smile. But Marcus Carter didn't flinch. He didn't lower his gaze or shuffle his feet. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be representing myself today." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained. "Well, Mr. Carter, I hope you've done your homework. The law isn't exactly something you can just wing." Another chuckle, this one louder, echoed through the room. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, and a few jurors exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh along or stay neutral. What no one in that courtroom knew, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Marcus Carter wasn't just any defendant. He wasn't some naive kid who thought he could outsmart the system. He wasn't even just a man fighting for his freedom. He was something far more dangerous. A man who had spent every waking moment of the past 2 years studying the law, dissecting case after case, memorizing statutes, and mastering the art of legal argumentation. He had turned his small prison cell into a classroom, his determination into a weapon. And now, standing in front of a judge who underestimated him and a prosecutor who thought he had already won, Marcus was about to show them all just how wrong they were. The case itself was high stakes, a charge that could send Marcus to prison for decades. The prosecution had evidence, witnesses, and a narrative that painted Marcus as guilty. But Marcus had something they didn't: an encyclopedic knowledge of the law and a mind sharp enough to find the cracks in their case. As the trial began, the judge continued to treat Marcus with thinly veiled amusement, dismissing his objections and rolling his eyes at his attempts to cross-examine witnesses. But then, something shifted. Marcus stood up to deliver his opening statement, and for the first time, the room fell completely silent. His words were precise, his arguments airtight. He cited case law with the ease of a seasoned attorney, pointing out flaws in the prosecution's case that no one else had noticed. The judge's smirk faded. The prosecutor's confidence wavered. And by the time Marcus finished, even the jurors were leaning forward, their eyes wide with surprise. But this was only the beginning. As the trial unfolded, Marcus continued to outmaneuver the prosecution at every turn, exposing inconsistencies, challenging evidence, and even catching a key witness in a lie. The judge, who had started the day laughing, now found himself staring at Marcus with a mix of disbelief and something else, something that looked a lot like respect. Yet, just as the tension in the courtroom reached its peak, just as it seemed Marcus might actually pull off the impossible, the prosecution dropped a bombshell. A new piece of evidence, one they claimed was irrefutable. The judge called for a recess, and as Marcus sat back down at the defense table, the weight of what was at stake settled over him like a storm cloud. What happened next would change everything. But for now, the courtroom was silent once more, the air thick with anticipation. The judge, the prosecutor, the jurors, they were all waiting. And so were we. The recess felt like it lasted an eternity. Marcus sat at the defense table, his hands resting lightly on the surface, his mind racing. The prosecution's new evidence loomed over him like a shadow, its details still unknown. He glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking suddenly loud. In the quiet room, every second felt like a countdown, but to what? He wasn't sure. Victory? Defeat? Or something in between? Marcus wasn't new to adversity. Growing up in a rough neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and trouble was always around the corner, he had learned early on that life wasn't fair. But he had also learned something else. That knowledge was power. When he was a kid, he'd spend hours at the local library, devouring books on history, science, and philosophy. He didn't just read to escape. He read to understand. To him, every book was a tool, a way to make sense of a world that often didn't make sense at all. That hunger for knowledge had stayed with him, even after he dropped out of high school to help support his family. Even after he got caught up in things he shouldn't have and found himself facing charges that could take away his freedom. While others might have given up, Marcus saw his situation as a challenge. If the system was stacked against him, he would learn the system. If the law was a maze, he would map it. And so, he began to study Data first. It was overwhelming. Legal jargon, complex statutes, and dense case law felt like a foreign language. But Marcus didn't give up. He requested books from the prison library, wrote letters to legal aid organizations, and even convinced a sympathetic guard to bring him old law textbooks. He read everything he could get his hands on, taking notes in the margins and highlighting passages until the pages were a sea of ink. Slowly but surely, the pieces started to come together. He began to see patterns, to understand how the law worked, and how it could be bent, or even broken, by those who knew how to use it. By the time his trial date arrived, Marcus felt ready. He had prepared for every possible scenario, every argument the prosecution might throw at him. But now, with this new evidence hanging over him, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. What did they have? A witness he hadn't accounted for? A piece of forensic evidence he hadn't anticipated? Or something worse? The courtroom doors swung open, snapping Marcus out of his thoughts. The prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper demeanor, strode in with a folder in his hand. He didn't look at Marcus, but the confidence in his step was unmistakable. Whatever was in that folder, he was sure it would seal the case. The judge returned to the bench, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm, "the prosecution has submitted new evidence for consideration. You'll have the opportunity to review it before we proceed. Do you need additional time to prepare?" Marcus hesitated. He wanted to say yes, to buy himself every possible second to analyze whatever was in that folder. But he also knew that time wasn't on his side. The longer the trial dragged on, the more opportunities the prosecution would have to wear him down. He had to stay sharp, stay focused. "No, Your Honor," he said finally. "I'm ready to proceed." The judge nodded, though his eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment longer than necessary. It was as if he was trying to figure him out, to understand how this young man, with no formal legal training, had managed to hold his own in a courtroom full of seasoned professionals. But Marcus wasn't interested in being understood. He was interested in winning. The prosecutor stepped forward, holding up the folder like it was a trophy. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit this as Exhibit A. It's a sworn affidavit from a new witness who has come forward with critical information about the defendant's involvement in the crime." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. A new witness? That was bad. Very bad. Witnesses were unpredictable, and affidavits were hard to challenge without time to prepare. He clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. The judge took the folder and began to read, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of paper as he turned each page. Marcus watched him closely, trying to gauge his reaction, but the judge's face gave nothing away. Finally, the judge looked up. "Mr. Carter, the prosecution's new witness claims to have seen you at the scene of the crime on the night in question. They've provided a detailed account of your actions, which, if true, would significantly impact the outcome of this trial. Do you have any response to this?" Marcus's mind raced. He didn't know who this witness was or what they were claiming, but he knew one thing. He hadn't been at the scene of the crime. He had an alibi, but proving it would take time. He didn't have. He had to think fast. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. "I'd like to request a brief recess to review this new evidence and prepare my response." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Use your time wisely, Mr. Carter." As the courtroom emptied, Marcus stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the folder now sitting on the defense table. He reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it and began to read. The affidavit was detailed, the witness's account vivid and convincing, but something about it felt off. The timeline didn't quite add up, and the description of the suspect didn't match him perfectly. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages, his mind working overtime. This wasn't just a witness. This was a trap, and if he didn't find a way out of it, it could cost him everything. But how? How could he prove the witness was lying? And more importantly, who had put them up to it? The answers were out there, hidden somewhere in the maze of lies and half-truths that had brought him to this moment. And Marcus was determined to find them. But time was running out. The recess was almost over, and the judge would soon call the court back to order. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a plan. He had come this far, fought this hard. He wasn't about to let some last-minute surprise take it all away. The courtroom doors opened again, and the bailiff stepped in. "Court is back in session," he announced. Marcus closed the folder and stood up, his expression calm but determined. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Or at least, he hoped he was.